Hey everybody, it is Chris. I've been looking at the 2024 Player's Handbook, and I was first just kind of going over all the stuff in the Player's Handbook. Now I want to start to analyze it. In my last video, I started a series where I'm looking at kind of the base damage potential of various character classes. I'm doing a lot of math, but I'm not going to go over all the math, but I will show it to you. So if you want to pause your screen and check my math, feel free, but I'm not going to bore you with going through all the numbers. What I am going to do is I'm going to show you some graphs so you can just see really easily up on your screen how classes compare at various levels compared to each other. But before we get into the topic for today, which is the rogue, what I will ask is, if you look, my subscriber count is getting very close to 100,000, and every video I'm asking, if you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing. Every subscription counts right now. I want to get to that 100,000 mark, and I am so close. I can taste it. So yeah, if you would consider subscribing, I would really appreciate it. So let's talk about damage. The first thing we need to talk about is baseline damage, because it is one thing for me to say that, you know, this build does 30 points of damage around. That's great. Well, is it? How do we know that's great? We have to have something to compare that 30 to know if it's high or if it's low. And that is where this comes in. So up on your screen right now, you're going to see the Warlock baseline. I have used this for years. And the idea is that if you were to take a Warlock, take Eldritch Blast, take Agonizing Blast, cast the Hex spell, increase your Charisma when you can, this is the damage you could expect at various levels of play. The levels are along the bottom, the damage is along the left side. And there's certain assumptions you have to make whenever you're working out average damage, like what will the armor class of the enemies be at various levels, and will you have advantage or disadvantage from any outside sources? Can you keep concentration up on that Hex spell? And so I do make assumptions. The assumptions I make are that you do keep concentration up on your Hex spell. I don't know if I should make that assumption or not, but I do. I figure the Warlock could use that assumption. I assume that you don't have any outside sources of advantage or disadvantage, so if you're going to get those benefits or penalties, it has to be something that's within the build itself that generates that for you. And the thing I like about the Warlock baseline, which has not changed for the 2024 rules, it is identical in 2024 as it was in 2014. None of the relevant factors have changed. Is that the increases to damage, if you look at the graph, you're going to see 3 points where there is a big jump, and that is levels 5, 11, and 17. That's when you get your additional Eldritch Blasts, right? So it does make sense. But I like those jumps being there because that tends to be where other classes see relevant big features too, and that's D&D kind of works that way, where we have what we call tiers of play. So Tier 1 is levels 1 through 4, and that's where your characters tend to die really easily. Ironically, it's the hardest tier of play in terms of challenge. Then Tier 2 starts at level 5, Tier 3 starts at level 11, and Tier 4 starts at level 17. So these jumps are at just the right spot. So I do like how this graph looks and how it functions. My issue with this, with the 2024 rules, and I'm not 100% certain that this is an issue yet, but my issue with this is I kind of suspect it might now be too low, because the Warlock damage didn't change, but the damage of pretty much everything else did, and from what I see for the most part, we're talking it went up. You know, there's tricks that you could do in 2014 to get damage even higher that have been like closed off. There's loopholes that have been shut down. But just with basic optimization, it seems to me that you can get damage higher with pretty much anything now. I mean, things like weapon mastery have improved our damage potential. There's been all kinds of class features added that improve our damage potential. Subclasses have been improved. So it feels like this might not be high enough. And when I looked at the monk, in fact, let me show you the monk. Excuse my scrolling here. I'm going to scroll a little bit. There we go. So there's the Warlock versus the Monk in 2014, and we can see the red line is the 2014 Monk, which did not do well. You can see it's barely above baseline, and then it falls below baseline at level 11 and higher, and that's using Flurry of Blows as often as they can. And if we look at 2024, the green line is 2024. And now the Monk has no problem beating the baseline at every level, and the gap is fairly significant. And so what I kind of wonder is, are we going to see this kind of situation with all the classes where everybody just easily beats baseline? And if that's the case, I mean, even the Warlock might easily beat baseline using Blade Pack now. So if everybody just easily beats the baseline, then it's not really a starting point anymore. So that's what I want to look at. And the reason I wanted to do the Rogue as my second video is because the Rogue is the class I was most concerned about. I believe it should be last week now. I released my video going over the 2024 Rogue in the Player's Handbook, and I mentioned that the Rogue is objectively better than it was in 2014. It got boosts, but it seems like fewer boosts than other classes. And things like Cutting Strike are a boost, technically, but Cutting Strike reduces your damage. And the Rogue, for damage, to begin with, wasn't that great in 2014. And so I was concerned that if our damage didn't go up for the Rogue, and it went up for everybody else, does that make the Rogue the weakest class in the game now? Potentially, because I'm not sure the Rogue was that far off the bottom once you took Monks out of the equation in 2014. So I definitely wanted to do Rogues next. And the first thing I want to do is look at the 2014 Rogue and see how it performs. So let's do that now. So what I want to do is just a very, very basic bare bones build that does some basic optimization techniques. Just like with the Warlock, I don't worry about what race you picked or what subclass you picked. All I cared about is ability score increases, potential feats, what weapons you use, that kind of thing. So this would be what I would consider a somewhat optimized 2014 Rogue. So I would go for a hand crossbow ranged build. Generally with rogues, the most damage you can do is actually in melee. The issue is that rogues defensively are not great. You have uncanny dodge, which helps a little bit, but you tend not to have the best armor class. You tend not to have the best hit points. And so, rogues going into melee was tough. So I generally like to stay at range most of the time with the rogue, unless I'm into a major gamble. So as a matter of practice, I assume that a rogue will be ranged. And I'm going to be assuming that for 2024 as well. So we're going to do a hand crossbow range build. We have steady aim at level 3, so we can get advantage, but that uses a bonus action. And dexterity, constitution would be the things I would normally consider concentrating on with a rogue. And I threw a little bit into wisdom because, perception, right? So yeah, that's the basics. And for ability score increases, I took Crossbow Expert at level 4. So Crossbow Expert is going to give us a bonus action attack with a hand crossbow. Now I can't combine that with steady aim. So if I'm going to use steady aim, then I don't have a bonus action attack. But if I have an ally next to an enemy, I qualify for sneak attack anyways, and then I'm better off using my bonus action to attack. I don't need advantage, because advantage, if you think about it, you're just rolling to attack twice and taking the better result. Well, with Crossbow Expert, if you use your bonus action to attack, you're rolling to attack twice and getting both results, so you could potentially hit twice, which would increase your damage, right? Dexterity will increase it to 18 at level 8. Dexterity will increase it to 20 at level 10. We'll take the Archery Combat Style at level 12. And Sharpshooter at level 16. And Sharpshooter, I think, is pretty important if you're using Crossbow Expert, because hand crossbows have terrible range, but their long range is okay. So it's 30 foot for short range, 120 foot for long range. That's a big difference. I mean, we can't afford sharpshooter until pretty late in our career, but I think it's worth taking eventually. And lucky, it doesn't matter what you took at 19. So when you do DPR calculations, you always have to make assumptions. So I just want to be transparent about what assumptions I make, so that when you see my results, you know what they include. Okay. So I assume 4 combats per long rest with 4 rounds per combat with 1 short rest in the middle. And that doesn't affect the rogue at all. I assume no outside source of advantage or disadvantage. I assume Tasha's optional class features are allowed for the 2014 rules, not for the 2024 rules. I am not using Elven Accuracy, so I won't be using it with the 2014, and I won't be using it with 2024. And I will mention that if you got Elven Accuracy on your rogue, the damage wasn't so bad. But if you I'm assuming you didn't. I am assuming you can always use sneak attack. And I find that rogues almost always can use sneak attack unless weird things happen. Like, maybe the enemy is invisible, so you have disadvantage. Well, now you could add advantage, and if you don't have an ally next to them, you're not getting sneak attack. So even with stuff like steady aim, you couldn't guarantee it necessarily 100% of the time, but you can do it enough of the time that I just assume that you can do it. And I assume that you can use the bonus action 50% of the time for using crossbow expert for the extra attack as soon as we get it. So the other 50% of the time, we're going to use our bonus action to grant us advantage to qualify for sneak attack. Okay, so here's how the damage looks for the 2014 rogue that I've just presented to you. So I have a chart here. You can see levels, then features. You can ignore that part if you like. I just track what the sneak attack die is, then the DPR calculations in red. So that's my math. And then I just have the Warlock baseline on the right. And we can see level 1, we have a DPR of 6.4, level 2, 7.7, level 3, 12.4. A lot more math once we get to level 4 and we add Crossbow Expert, but it ends up being 12.8 at level 4. And then we got level 5 and we're at 15.8, and it doesn't change at level 6, it's still 15.8. Level 7, it's 18.9. Level 8, it's 19.8. Level 9, we got 22.8. Level 10, we got 25.1. Level 11, 28.3. Level 12, 31. Level 13, it's 34.4. Level 14, it doesn't change. At level 15, we're at 36.9, and now level 16 will take a little bit longer. So I had a lot of math to do as soon as we add Sharpshooter, because now I need to determine whether we're better off using Sharpshooter or not using Sharpshooter. So first we see without Sharpshooter, and it's 36.9 is the total. Then with Sharpshooter, what we can see is if we are attacking twice, then we can do 38 points of damage around. If we're attacking only once, it's 36.9, which is the same as not using Sharpshooter. So it's only of an advantage to us if we're making 2 attacks. So I just assume if we got 2 attacks, we'll use Sharpshooter. If we don't have 2 attacks, we won't. And we end up with 37.2. When we get to level 17, though, that changes. In fact, now we do more damage without Sharpshooter. And I'm talking about the -5 plus 10, by the way. The range advantage and the ignoring cover still apply 100% of the time. But when it comes to just the straight damage, we're better off not doing the -5 plus 10. And the reason for this is Sharpshooter tends to perform better. The -5 plus 10 mechanic tends to perform better on builds that don't add a lot to damage. Rogues do add a lot to damage because they have this huge sneak attack benefit. The disadvantage of the rogue is you're only attacking once. So Sharpshooter just isn't ideal for a rogue. That's why I didn't worry about it till later. We need it for the range, but not for the damage. So level 16, we'll use Sharpshooter some of the time. Level 17, we're not going to use the -5 plus 10 at all. It does not help us. At levels 18, we're 41.1. Level 19, we're 44.8. And no increase at level 20. We're still at 44.8. And what I've got there down at the bottom, 531.5. That is, if I take all 20 levels, take the DPRs and add them together, it's 531.5. If If I divide that by 20, we get 26.6, which means your average DPR over 20 levels with the rogue is 26.6. A warlock does 20.3, so that is 31% over the warlock baseline. And that might sound like a decent amount, and you might be thinking, you know, I've played rogues and it doesn't feel like I'm doing that much damage. But if we look at the graph, it does kind of explain what's going on. So the blue line is our warlock baseline, and the red line are the damage calculations we just did. Okay? And what should be fairly apparent here, or stand out here, is that the red line is relatively a straight line. So the blue line has those big bumps at 5, 11, and 17, those predictable levels. The rogue doesn't get those. The rogue gets a very linear progression. They get the same damage boost at level 3 that they get at level 5, that they get at level 7, that they get at level 9. So you end up with this relatively straight line. And, you know, D&D, for the most part, doesn't work that way. And so what ends up happening is if we look right here, levels 5, level 6, level 7, level 8, these are levels of play that we see at tables all the time. Certainly well more than we see those super high levels where we see the rogue doing quite well. Here, the rogue is really struggling. And this is where they need to not struggle, because this is when we tend to play D&D the most. This is where D&D works really well most of the time, but doesn't work so well for the rogue. All right, so ideally, what we want to see is the rogue really do better at those levels. Well, I'm not sure they do unless. There's an unless, and the unless is unless we cast True Strike. Now, when I went over the rogue, I said, I think they're probably the weakest class in the game now. Maybe not by a lot, maybe just by a little bit. And in my head, what I'm thinking is they just got fewer goodies than everybody else. And what the rogue really probably needed was a little bit of a boost at levels 5, 11, and 17, and they didn't get it. It's not exactly true. They did get it. They just didn't put it under the rogue. They put it under True Strike. So True Strike works probably better for the rogue than any other class in the game. And the reason is because the rogue does make weapon attacks, but only attacks once. And that tends to work with True Strike, which uses your magic action to cast. So if I have extra attack, then if I cast True Strike, I don't get extra attack. Unless I'm a Valor Bard or an Eldritch Knight, and those have their own problems. Combining extra attack with True Strike using either of those features has their own problems that I will cover when I go over those classes. But with the Rogue, it is clean. You're only making one attack anyways, unless you somehow work out a bonus action attack, which isn't built into the class. So if we just don't do that and just attack once and have one huge attack, what we get is a damage boost at levels 5, 11, and 17, which is exactly where we want. The other thing, like I know some of you are probably thinking in your head, what about Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade? Rogues have always been able to do those, and they have. The issue with those is they don't work at range. True Strike works with ranged attacks, so I can use a ranged weapon and cast True Strike, not Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade. And like I mentioned before, I think keeping your rogue out of melee is the way to go, and True Strike allows you to do that. And there's another benefit too, is that you're going to have a reliable damage. If something is resistant to piercing damage, well, now I can change the damage type to radiant damage, which is probably going to work. So this is just really, really good for rogues. Now, obviously, Arcane Tricksters can just choose True Strike, but any rogue can get True Strike, and it's not that hard. You could just be a High Elf, or you could just take the Magic Initiate Wizard feat. You could also take Magic Initiate. Does any other Magic Initiate feat get you that? I don't think so. I think it's got to be Magic Initiate Wizard, which is the one you would want to take anyways. So you can get True Strike on any rogue, and I kind of think you should get True Strike on every rogue. I wish they told you that under the rogue class, but they didn't. So I'm telling you now, if you're going to make a rogue, you should be looking at True Strike. Okay? And that is going to be my assumption when I do my 2024 numbers is let's use True Strike. So we've got species undefined. I wrote race here. It's species now. Species undefined, subclass undefined. We're going to just use a light crossbow. And I had a conversation with somebody 2 days ago where they had mentioned, you know, the problem with rogue is they're going to be about 30% behind other marshals when it comes to damage. And they just can't do anything cool with their attack action because they're going to be forced to use things like Nick or Vex, so no control options whatsoever. And they're basically forced to get some kind of reaction attack to even compete. I am going to assume no reaction attack. We're going to attack once per round, and that's it. And we're not going to use Nick, and we're not going to use Vex. We're going to use light crossbow, which is going to give us slow, which is, I mean, it's not necessarily the strongest control option, but it is a control option. All right. We're going to use steady aim at level 3. And we're going to start with intelligence of +2, dexterity of +1. We're going to get True Strike through either High Elf or Magic Initiate Wizard. Now, I also should mention that I've gone with intelligence here. You don't have to go with intelligence. You could also go with wisdom or charisma. So if you want to make your swashbuckler rogue, you probably go charisma. If you're making your mastermind rogue, then probably intelligence. And then if you want to make your halfling chef, then you go wisdom, and you would actually have a reason to take the chef feat. So, yeah, depending on the type of rogue, might depend on the mental ability score that you're going to use, but I think pretty much every rogue should consider focusing on a mental ability score, which is why the video title and why the thumbnail that you saw. Because we're going intelligence, I figured Poisoner is an obvious feat to take at level 4, gets our intelligence to 18, and now I should mention that I am not going to include anything from the Poisoner feat in regards to the DPR, because if we go intelligence, we might go Poisoner. If we go, charisma, we might go something else, maybe Inspiring Leader. If we go wisdom, we might go something else, maybe Fey Touched or something. I don't think all rogues would be looking at poison damage. And the second thing about Poisoner is you have to have the poison to use in the first place. And it costs money, or you have to find it during adventuring. And so I just think it's easier to leave it off. I would take it, so I'm putting it there, but I'm going to leave it off my calculations. We're going to increase our intelligence first to 20 at level 8. Now, I still want to get my dexterity to 20. So I'm going to increase my dexterity by 2 at 10, and then sharpshooter at 12, and then skulker at 16. And then at level 19, I'll take the epic boon of combat prowess. That's the one where if you miss, you can hit instead. And since you're only attacking once, it is pretty important that you hit with the rogue. And with the column, the only thing I need to let you know about is the center column sneak attack is now sneak attack and true strike. So I will show both the sneak attack dice and true strike dice. But mainly, let's look at the DPR. And if you want to pause and double check my numbers, feel free. Because the results you're going to see are going to be, they were certainly surprising to me. I think I've kind of spoiled that they're going to be better than I would have thought. But they definitely surprised me how good they were. So we have 7 at level 1, we have 8.5 at level 2, we have 14 at level 3, 14.2 level 4, 20.8 at level 5 and 6, 24 at level 7, 24.9 at level 8, 28.2 at level 9, still 28.2 at level 10, 34.8 at 11, 34.8 at 12. Level 13, we have 38, 38 at 14, 41.4 at 15, also at 16, 41.4, 48 at 17. Level 18, 48, level 19, 59.7, and 20, 59.7, which is a total of 634.4, or 31.7 per round. That's 56% over the Warlock baseline. Now that maybe doesn't seem like a huge increase to the Rogue, but when we look at it on the graph, you'll see why I was so pleased. So blue line, Warlock baseline, red line, 2014 Rogue, green line, 2024 Rogue, and look at 5, 6, 7, and 8. The problem is solved. It's solved because we got the big boost where we needed it. Level 11, again, looks so much better now. Level 17, it looks so much better now. And never mind the fact that the green line exceeds the red line from level 1 up. Just all the way up. And 0 reaction attacks here. Now, what I want to do now is show you my favorite graph. And this one I won't spoil. Going to show you my favorite graph now. Blue line is the Warlock baseline. Red line is the 2024 Monk. And the green line is the 2024 Rogue. Those two lines are basically lockstep all the way from levels 1 through 20. Sometimes the Rogue's doing more damage, sometimes the Monk's doing more damage. They're kind of intertwined. They're both comfortably above baseline the whole time, and they're very comparable. You know how comparable they are? The difference in DPR over 20 levels from the 2014 or the 2024 Monk and the 2024 Rogue is 0.1. They're basically the same. So on average, these two lines are basically the exact same value, and they kind of match each other all the way up. That's thrilling, because what that tells me is that a ranged rogue attacking once per round does compare to other marshals. At least the monk, and the monk looked pretty darn good to me. We'll see as we add other classes, but this is so encouraging. Now, what I did with the monk is I also looked at maybe optimizing a build and seeing, how much the damage increased, which was a fair amount. What I want to do is see if we can do the same thing with the rogue. So we are going to use the assassin. So this is an assassin optimized range build. We're just going to take high elf to get true strike. Take the criminal background, gives us the alert feat. At level 1, we're going to dip fighter. A few reasons why I would do this with a real optimized build. So it's going to give us archery fighting style, which is great. It's going to give us proficiency in heavy crossbow, which I think is a great move. Not only does it increase our maximum range, but we get the push mastery, which I think is better than the slow mastery for most targets. Push doesn't work on gargantuan or huge targets. But against anybody else, I think I would prefer a push over a slow. Never mind the fact that the heavy crossbow damage is better. But also, we're going to get armor. And if we are going to focus on intelligence first, I want to be in medium armor. And as long as I have a dexterity modifier of +2, I'm going to have a fairly decent armor class until I start getting that dex up, at which point I would switch to studded leather. We have to have a strength of 13 because the heavy crossbow is heavy, which means that we qualify for the damage boost from Great Weapon Master, which we're going to take. Then dexterity 17, constitution 12, intelligence 16, wisdom 8, charisma 8. Feats, we're going to get alert, and then we're going to increase our intelligence up to 20. Then we're going to take Great Weapon Master, then sharpshooter. Then we'll get our dexterity up to 20, so we will get our dexterity to 20. And boon of combat prowess, and same assumptions that I made with the other builds. One thing you might notice in the math, though, that I should explain is that because we multi-class, because we're dipping fighter, that means that we're increasing our attack score a level later. So our intelligence goes to 18 at level 5 instead of level 4, and then to 20 at level 9 instead of level 8. So at level 4 and 8, we'll actually see a slight decrease to our chance to hit. And I've got the math here. Basically, instead of 91% chance to hit, we'll have an 88% chance to hit. So I've added an additional column here because as an assassin, we will have surprising strikes. Surprising strikes is, I think, better than people think, though I think it probably comes down to the levels that you normally play. If you normally play at lower levels, surprising strikes is okay, but if you play at least a reasonable amount of high level, surprising strikes I think is quite good. And we'll see that in the numbers here. So we're going to start with 6.3, 8.9, 10.4, 16.1. Maths there if you want to check it. Level 5, we go to 20.1, then 24.5, 24.8, 28.6, 29.5. Level 10, we go to 33.4, then 40.8, then 44.6, 46.7, 49.5. One thing you should be noticing is the damage is going up every level. We didn't see that with either the 2014 or 2024 Rogue, and that's because of surprising strikes. I want to go back here and talk about level 14 because something important happens here that I forgot to mention. So at level 13 in Assassin, we get Envenom Weapons, which allows us to use the Poison Cunning Strike option, which costs 1d6 sneak attack. And whenever we use it, a creature that fails its saving throw takes 2d6 poison damage, and that ignores resistance to poison damage. Furthermore, if they fail a second save, they take another 2d6 damage, and so on. Technically speaking, even if we assume 50% chance to make their save, this should increase the damage of the assassin, because it is likely that at least some of the time, creatures will fail more than one saving throw. The problem is, with including that in the damage, is that number one, number of creatures are immune to poison, and so we won't be using Envenom Weapons on them. And number two, even if they take more than the 2d6 damage, so, you know, the next round comes along and they fail their saving throw a second time, they have to still be alive. And so then I suddenly have to assume that this enemy is surviving another round of combat in order to take this damage the following round. I don't want to make those assumptions. I'm assuming Envenom Weapons is a wash for damage. Still totally worth it, because we're not doing Envenom Weapons for damage. We're doing Envenom Weapons to inflict the poisoned condition on enemies. And essentially, because the damage is a wash, it's free, so you should do it all the time that an enemy is not immune to poison. It is just a freebie that's really, really good, that the assassins should absolutely take advantage of, that's not going to show in the damage numbers. Just wanted to mention that before we move on. So let's move on. Level 15, we got 49.7, then we go to 53.5, 58.1, 71.1 at level 18. I am assuming that a creature has a 50% chance of making the save against Death Strike, and I'm assuming a 4-round combat. So Death Strike will only occur on round 1, so I have to divide it by 4, and then divide it again by 2, because half the enemies I assume will save, so they won't take the Death Strike. You can still see, even then, it's a massive increase to damage. And then level 19, 71.4, and level 20, 82.6, which is a big, big number. So our 20 level average is 770.6, divided by 20 is 38.5. That is 90% over Warlock DPR. So the values for the Rogue, so our Warlock baseline is 20.3. For the 2014 Rogue, it's 26.6. Jumps to 31.7 for 2024, and we do a little bit of optimization and we're all the way up to 38.5. So blue line is the Warlock, red line is the 2014 Rogue, green line is the 2024 Rogue. Throw a little bit of optimization in, that's our dark green line. Now we can see that the damage doesn't increase all that much at lower levels, but once we start getting into higher levels, then we get into some really fantastic damage. So yeah, I mean, if you want the most damage at level 20, going with an assassin and just shooting once a round with a heavy crossbow, you can do over 80 points of damage. And there's more to it than just 80 points of damage. Consider that it's an enemy and they're concentrating on a spell. Well, they're going to have, I think the maximum DC for a concentration save now is 30. Well, they're going to have a 30. You know, guaranteed. Even if you roll lousy, they're going to have a 30. So, you know, there's other benefits as well. We're also pushing. We're also potentially poisoning every single round. So there is control. Multiple sources of control that are happening for free and great damage. And this is a subclass that I consider to be, you know, okay. I certainly felt the assassin was better than I was hearing online. And I mean, there's your numbers. I think that proves it. And you know, yeah, we're giving good damage, but it's just one huge attack. Now, naturally, if you can give the rogue a reaction attack, these numbers spike a fair bit, because what the idea of a reaction attack is, if you attack again when it's not your turn, you can sneak attack again. So you can increase your damage quite a bit that way, though you won't be able to necessarily do a true strike unless somehow you're making an opportunity attack. But for most reaction attacks that you would be making with a ranged build, that's not going to be the case. But yeah, really good damage there. We can get it even high. I know some of you have got to be wondering, what if we did go into melee? What would it look like? Now the one thing I should mention, though, is if you go into melee, you might be tempted to use 2 weapons and use the nick property, and I totally get that. But if you do that, you cannot use True Strike. And that is a huge penalty. If you want to use True Strike, your best bet is probably grab a rapier and then, just use the Vex Mastery. And, it makes it easier to get advantage some of the time. Which is maybe good, because things like steady aim can be harder to use when you are in melee. So, maybe you need it. But, yeah, I did a build for the rapier and True Strike. And then what I did is I took Sentinel, and then I assumed that you would get a reaction attack. I believe I assumed you'd get it 20% of the time. Okay? And this is what it would look like on a graph. I'm not going to bother showing you all the calculations on this one. This is just more for interest's sake. The purple line is the melee rogue, and what we see is at high levels, they even outdamage the ranged assassin. I used assassin for the melee build as well. But you'll notice until level 10, there's no improvement at all. At level 11, guess what? That's when they get Sentinel. I did the fighter dip as well. That's when they get Sentinel. So that's why it suddenly increases. Though you are using your reaction. That means no uncanny dodge, right, on those 20% of turns. But that's how much more damage it is. It's a bit more damage, but I don't think it's a huge amount more damage. And being that it doesn't even start being more damage until level 11, I'm taking, if I'm playing a rogue, I'm playing a ranged rogue. I think these numbers are conclusive that, it is worth the tiny bit of damage you might give up by going range, for the various advantages that range gives you. Never mind the fact, and this doesn't show up on a whiteboard, that steady aim is a lot easier to use if you're attacking at range, because you don't have to worry about getting into position the same way you do with melee. So that is the rogue. Really impressed. Really impressed. When I look at the monk and the rogue here, I was not expecting this. When I put the values into the graph and then they calculated them out and I saw this, I was so thrilled to see that these two classes were so close together. And I have to wonder, I told you when I did the rogue video that I thought they were the weakest class in the game now. I'm not sure anymore. I'm just not sure, because that damage was part of that assumption. Just not thinking about what True Strike would do for the rogue, because it really does a lot for the rogue. And it's unfortunate that it's not just built into the class, and that you actually have to, take a feat or a species or a subclass to give you True Strike, which I think you have to do. Also, it's a little unfortunate that you're not focusing on dexterity right away. You'll have a 16, I assume, right, and eventually get to a 20, as I did in every build that I did here, fairly easily, but not until later. And that means either you get a dip to get some armor, or you're having a slightly lower armor class at lower levels. Not at level 1, right? But level 4 and level 8, I would expect to be 1 or maybe even 2 armor class behind. And then you'll catch up again at level 10, and then by level 12, it should be the same. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, the rogue has definitely gone mental. True Strike is the way to go. As long as you include it, then I think the rogue does just fine. All right, so that is the rogue. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about the fighter. I've done a ton of fighter builds. I will not be presenting them all. I'm going to be doing the same thing here. I will show a base build, and I will show one optimized build, and I'll show you how they compare to the monk and to the rogue. Okay, and to the warlock baseline, which may or may not continue to be my baseline in the future. We'll talk about that when we get to the end of the series. So until then, I'm gonna sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next time.